So thank you so much for talking to our students. I really appreciate your time today. I know that you have a lot of experience in the work environment with recruiting and managing teams, and we're really excited about hearing about that. Could you tell the students a little bit, first introduce yourself, tell them about your role, and then maybe we can expand from there.
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Daniel Rein. I have worked in talent acquisition and recruiting for the past 13 or so years. I began as, a recruiter focused on identifying, talent, matching them for the right roles. And then I've transitioned over the last few years to more managing operations and teams of recruiters. And one of the things that's been really interesting over the last probably a year and a half since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, is the way that we kind of do things. A lot of the industry was really geared towards in-person meetings and things like that, but now a good number of the people that we're working with and that we place in new jobs and things like that are working remotely versus in person. Also, the entire selection process is completely different, where a lot of things are done remotely. There's things that you would do out of the geography you're located in terms of skills testing. A lot of that stuff was done, in person, but now it's done remotely. How we onboard talent is done completely remotely. As before it was kind of done a lot in person, actually verifying documentation in person and things of that nature. But kind of the way that we've done things has been, completely different over the last 18 months or so.
So, the pandemic has really impacted everybody's jobs. What do you think have been your greatest challenges as a recruiter since the pandemic started?
So one of the biggest challenges, and everyone, it's been well publicized, the Great Resignation, where people, don't want to, they've gotten used to a different lifestyle of working remotely, and if their current employer, does not, have an appetite for remote work or a hybrid schedule or anything like that, it's not something that they're apt to return to or even to apply to. So that's been kind of the biggest struggle, has been the geography. You could live, 5, 10 miles from an office, but there's a big portion of the population that would like to stay working remotely, pretty much forever, and they won't even consider anything that doesn't have to deal, with, they don't want to be on site at all.
So how are you guys handling that challenge? Have you done anything to help overcome it with the applicants?
Well, I think it's a realistic thing, where the trends have certainly changed. So the biggest portion of that is employers, have to adapt to a certain extent. And I think a lot of them have really become cognizant of that, where, maybe in the past they required someone to be in an office 5 days a week, or now, hey, we'll consider some type of remote type schedule. I think, the advances in technology have gone kind of great, lengths here, where there's certain people that, if they don't want to return to an office, you can't kind of force them to do something that they don't want to do. So, it is a realistic concern where we kind of have to, listen, to what they want to do. And because the worst case scenario would be is if somebody starts a job working on site and they really don't want to be there, to come around, 2, 3 weeks, a month down the road and say, this isn't for me, I really want to be at home, and then, just kind of leave. So, it's the same thing where wouldn't want to put somebody in a job where, maybe it didn't, pay enough, or it, pre-2020, if the commute was a little too far, those things kind of stick with people. So, you have to get to the bottom of what that real concern is, because, right now there's still issues with childcare. There's issues, all types of things and factors that, what goes into that, and certain people, they just feel like they're more productive working at home.
I can understand that. So, what do you think about successes? What are the big successes or the great takeaways from the pandemic that we're going to keep?
Well, we were kind of joking about this prior, but the use of technology has gone, a really long way, where, there are changes in the work environment. And to kind of buoy on what we were just talking about, hey, if I'm in San Francisco and somebody else is in New York, maybe a year or two prior, we'd fly in together to have a meeting. Now you can get people all around the world. They're used to doing things virtually that they hadn't been prior. Um, Also, the productivity factor, when people don't have to commute, that kind of factors in. And then also, just to kind of hit on some of the geography things too, if a physical office was located, let's say in Los Angeles, and you're looking for the most qualified person for that job, and they live in Dallas, I think companies are more apt to hire that person in Dallas than they probably would have before. So it's opened up new opportunities with new companies that maybe didn't exist pre-pandemic.
So when looking at employers, and competing for talent, have you noticed that they've really gotten on board with the change, or do you think there's some winners and some losers? Maybe some area of the industries that are being more proactive with this.
Yeah, I think, honestly, when you look at, and this is kind of typical for how a lot of things typically work with employment. A lot of large technology companies, the ones that have been innovators in the past, are the ones that have taken this on really, quickly and reduced their real estate footprint. The example that I would give you would be, Salesforce has reduced their real estate footprint. They've also, opened up to more of a hybrid type approach. And Google has done a lot of similar things. I think that there are companies that are more apt to do that, where they've really done a lot of analysis of productivity and things of that nature, probably in the first 6 months of the pandemic, to say, hey, we're pretty much getting 90 to 100% of the same productivity out of our staff, with them working either hybrid or remote, where they can continue it. Now, there are certain companies that tend to be losers, but I don't really think of it that way, because a lot of them, have been essential type services and businesses, where if you look at like a construction company, or companies like that, where they require people to actually be on site and doing the work, they can't tap into some of the technology advantages, or some of the advantages with hiring people out of state or out of that geography. But the plus for them is that there wasn't as much of a dip in their business from the pandemic. So I wouldn't say that they're a loser, but I think that there are more companies that are apt to make those changes based on what they've seen, and they've done it very effectively.
Yeah, have you seen recruiting and social media being a big change? Is there more reliance on social media to attract applicants, or how are they're going about attracting the applicants, given that nobody wants to go back to the work environment?
Yeah, it's interesting, that you bring that up, because if you think about social media for recruiting or employment or anything like that, obviously LinkedIn is going to be the key one that you look at. There has been a lot of activity there, with people sharing experiences of their stories and things like that. One of the things that we've seen an uptick of, believe it or not, you know people have done a really good job from a recruiting and staffing perspective and networking through Instagram. I, actually hired somebody through an Instagram DM earlier this year. And then TikTok. TikTok has been used quite a bit for people to show some of their frustrations, and some of the real positives of their job situation. So that has changed a little bit, and it's helped kind of shape people's minds from a social media perspective. Also, our activity in terms of sharing our open positions and things like that is up nearly 120% year to date from our social accounts, as well. So it looks like there's an increased activity for where people look for jobs versus kind of the traditional way that they looked before on traditional job boards and things like that.
So, Glassdoor, Indeed, ZipRecruiter, LinkedIn, I think those are the big ones. Are there
Mhm.
any other big ones that are trending right now?
Yeah, one of the things that I've found that has trended as well is, there is a job board on Google which aggregates very similarly to Indeed, um, and then a lot of the stuff that has happened, especially with entry level, type folks is. There's a company called Handshake that aggregates a lot of the traditional university job boards, and the people can apply there. But yeah, you hit on a lot of the big ones, but people are finding new ways to get hired. It's just a different way to network where maybe 15, 20 years ago, you would call in and try to network with somebody, or there's a lot of stuff that you would do through an internship or things of that nature, where that still holds a lot of value to make those connections. Whereas now you can pretty much access almost anybody that you'd like, whether it is through LinkedIn or things like that. That doesn't necessarily have to be an open job, but you can connect with a hiring manager that way.
That's interesting that you say Google Job Boards. I usually recommend that for looking for internships, because it
Yeah,
collates all the jobs in the area.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you are a supervisor of recruiters and you have,
Mhm.
I'm assuming, a virtual team right now. Is that
100% virtual. Yeah.
so? What is it like managing that and recruiting, I guess, 100% virtually at this point, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because this was not a virtual type business before. There would be conversations that you would have kind of on the fly constantly, but right now it's not. It makes it a lot more difficult. Everything has to be scheduled, because the reality of life is a lot different, where people have personal appointments and children remote learning and things like that. So everything has to be scheduled. I try to be on video as much as possible, utilize our technology, constantly communicating. The communication factor is the most challenging, where, in the past, you could walk by somebody's desk and see what they were up to or what they're doing or if they're available. Here, it's a lot more challenging, especially when, you know, if they're a recruiter, they're constantly talking to job seekers and applicants, and it's not as easy to tell, what they're up to. So, sometimes, there have to be certain concessions that you make as a supervisor, in terms of like, reaction time and things like that. But, I've tried to schedule as much stuff as possible just so that we can have, all those check-ins and touch points, maybe a little bit more than before.
So, with the viewers being mostly either management students or HR students, and knowing that some of this environment from the pandemic is here to stay, what do you think are the hot skills that they need to develop to cope in the new reality?
Obviously, get familiar with Zoom. That would be a good, thing. I would say, the biggest things, utilization of technology, which doesn't seem to be, big. If you're going to get into management or things like that, there's a lot of tools at your disposal now in terms of, training yourself and training your team, to explore. Also, I would really spend a lot of time, planning ahead. I know that this doesn't really kind of factor into that, but it's kind of developing your own toolbox of like what you need to do and what, and how to, communicate. I think that's the biggest issue, certainly that we've seen with clients that we work with. Our internal team has been communication. A lot of the nonverbal cues that, like right now, all you see is my head. You don't see the rest of my body and things like that. Just building that awareness and being cognizant of a lot of that stuff, and then really kind of shaping, when you do have, those in person, meetings and things like that, how valuable that they'll be, and then just how learning has kind of transitioned and changed over the last year and a half or so, and how you can kind of incorporate that into your day to day.
So you haven't really talked about that. Can you expand on that more, how learning has changed in the work environment and how they need to work on this more?
Yeah, if you're going to hire and train somebody, I was very big proponent of sitting with them at their desk and doing a lot of the stuff together versus, training through, video or, giving there's a lot of companies that I've come across where they basically give you a binder and say, no matter what your job is, say, okay, read page 22 and then do this and whatever, where it goes back to the other point. You really have to kind of schedule a lot of things and plan ahead of how you can not only facilitate that in-person type approach even when you're separate, but make it more interactive. So I think that's the biggest thing, is even if you're spending the time with somebody, like how do you get the most out of it? So that has continued to be a challenge for me, but I've kind of built a strategy around that. And really, sharing the screens, and I think certain aspects of it have been, even more positive, where I can actually see what somebody's doing and kind of walk them through what my process would be, whereas before it would be a little clunky and stuff like that. So I think how you incorporate the technology, whether it's Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Google or whatever, there's a lot of things you can do where it would have been a little bit more challenging in the past. But you really have to have a strong plan to kind of execute it, and then not even just check in with the person that you're training and the team that's already existing and stuff like that, but check in with yourself at the end of the day. Hey, did I accomplish what I wanted to? What do I do going forward? How do I, so that's been an ongoing struggle, but it's really like you almost have to set an agenda for yourself, every half hour. This is what I need to accomplish, this is what I need to do. How do I pull that out of that person? And things like that to manage performance.
That's a really great point, because being able to organize is really important, but also being able to plan ahead. I know that I tell my students that you need to have annual goals. What are your goals that you want to put on your resume? If you think about your annual goals, how are you going to accomplish that over the year? It doesn't matter if you're a student or you're working in HR, you're still progressing towards your ultimate career. And if you want to have skills to put on your resume when you graduate, well, you need to plan ahead for that, at least a year timeline, to give yourself time to acquire those skills. So I agree, that is a wonderful skill that they really do need to work on. And of course, we have a lot of non-traditional students, so a lot of them already have some of these skills, but it's great. It's a great reminder that it needs to be linked to annual goals and daily goals. So,
Yeah.
so as a final thought, do you have any final parting thoughts, career advice for anybody who wants to get into recruiting or management? So obviously you're a manager of a team. Any final thoughts for this group?
Yeah, what I would say, mainly, you referenced, building your resume and things of that nature. I would really kind of focus on, what job you are seeking and how your past experiences kind of, really frame into that. There seems to be, a misconception when people build their resumes of, hey, I just have to list everything I've done here, where, if that's something that you've done, great, but if it's not applicable, to that end goal, maybe that's something that you should kind of leave out. And then also, as we've talked about moving towards that virtual world, the flip side of it, if there's a lot of stuff that you want to, include, the one page resume is kind of a thing of the past. For me to scroll from page one to page two is not really that big of a deal. But, if we're talking about you have 2 years of experience and it's 14 pages, that's a little excessive. But, I wouldn't, I would, kind of think outside of those conventional, things that have been ingrained in us for a lot of years. But, really think of what that end goal is, how you shape it. I think that would be, the best way to put that together.
I'm so glad you expanded on that. That's one of the things I'm constantly telling students. If it doesn't apply to the job you want, don't put it on your resume. it's a piece of marketing that's trying to get you the interview. And if it's cluttered up with irrelevant information that you're proud of, it's not going to help you get the job. And I don't know how many times I've heard, well, I have to keep it to one page. Well, you have 5 years of experience in the
Right.
military or here or there. You've got enough experience to make at least 2 pages here.
Right.
You really need to share those skills, especially the transferable skills. Really
Right.
pitch those out there. Yeah,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm glad. Any other resume do's and don'ts, since we're on that, you do recruiting?
Um, yeah, I would, I think there it's rare, but you really want to, and I'll focus on the do's. If you have any progression in your, jobs, you definitely want to show that. Hey, maybe I was, an HR generalist and I moved to, HR business partner. You want to show that progression because, it's a sign of promotion. And then also a lot of ways that people review resumes these days, it's very similar to search engine optimization. So it's very keyword driven. So the more times that you have certain keywords, the better that, if somebody uses an applicant tracking system and they score the resumes, your resume will score better. Just if you have certain terms in there, a little bit more. And then, what you just referenced also, if there's something that's not applicable, or if you don't think it is, it's all how you position it. So it can be applicable. Maybe you're just describing it in a way that doesn't resonate with the intended audience. So and I would do that, and then just a little pet peeve. Make sure it's in chronological order as long as the experience is relevant. If you're talking about applying for a position as a compensation analyst, for example, and the last job that you had was working at Subway, maybe that would be a way to deviate. But you know that's kind of an odd extreme, but chronologically people want to see progression.
Okay, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time in talking to the students, and your experience was wonderful. Thank you.